Dear Professor Pernice, lieber Herr Professor, Vice President, Herr Vizepräsident, meine Damen und Herren, es ist für mich ein Privileg, die heutige Humboldt-Rede eröffnen und dazu begrüßen zu dürfen. Das ist eine lange Tradition, wo Debatten auf sehr hohem Niveau über Themen geführt werden, die Deutschland, Europa und die Welt bewegen. Und ich glaube, dafür kann es keinen besseren Ort geben als diese prestigereiche Universität, älteste Berlins, 29 Nobelpreisträger ausgebildet, und seit 1997 gibt es hier von Professor Ingolf Pernice begründet das Walter-Hallstein-Institut für europäisches Verfassungsrecht. Seit 2000 die Tradition dieser Humboldt-Reden, begonnen mit Joschka Fischer damals, seither viele große Namen, Amato, Giscard, Bertie Ahern, Richard von Weizsäcker, viele andere, auch kritische Geister, was Europa betrifft, wie Václav Klaus oder Lech Kaczynski, und Vertreter auch der europäischen Institutionen. Präsidenten des Europäischen Parlaments, Pöttering, Buzek, Schulz, EZB-Präsident Trichet, Europäischer Ratspräsident Van Rompuy und zuletzt im Mai 2014 Kommissionspräsident Barroso. All das war und ist nur möglich wegen und dank des Esprits und des Nachdrucks, des Spiritus Rector dieser Redenserie, das Mastermind, wie man auf Neudeutsch so schön sagt. Daher an dieser Stelle mein herzlicher Dank, Herr Professor Pernice, an Sie und an Ihr Team, Frau Müller, die hier unermüdlich über 15 Jahre lang diese Institution der Humboldt-Rede hier an der Universität etabliert, verfestigt haben. Sie sind einer dieser wahrhaften Europäer. In Tagen wie diesen können wir gar nicht genug davon haben, und ich danke Ihnen sehr, sehr herzlich für Ihr Engagement, Herr Professor. We have tonight, another representative of an EU institution with us, Vice President for the Euro and Social Dialogue, Valdis Dombrovskis. You will know that for more than 4 years he was Prime Minister of his country, Latvia. His veto will then be looked at more closely by Professor Pernice. But just to say that he knows the world of science, the world of national politics, and the world of European politics quite well, at a relatively young age still, of 44 years. But these different disciplines, science, national politics, European politics, they look so much in harmony, but in these days, less and less so. There is more dissonance between national politics and European politics, and often also between science and politics in general. He's now one of the vice presidents in this, if I may say, still maybe new commission under President Jean-Claude Juncker, coordinating important tasks, dossiers like the Euro and the social dialogue. And this is about important aspects like looking at the social impact of European policies, something which many say we have been disregarding too much in the past. Ensuring the democratic support and legitimacy of the reform process in European countries, improving the economic convergence between different countries and the control of this convergence, particularly in the Eurozone, and last but not least, the further development, deepening of the European Economic and Monetary Union. One key word which I think goes for the economic side of Europe as much as it goes these days on the issue of migration is solidarity. And I think Vice President Dombrovskis is particularly well placed to discuss also this aspect of solidarity, different angles. I'm very much looking forward to having a lively debate with you tonight. And with this, Professor Pernice, I would hand over to you for your welcoming words. Thank you.
Vice President, Excellencies, dear Mr. Kühnel, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this first Humboldt speech on Europe this fall 2015. It is my specific honor to welcoming Valdis Dombrovskis, the former Prime Minister of Latvia, and the acting Vice President of the European Commission, responsible for the team Euro and Social Dialogue. Dear Vice President, as I read from your website, your responsibilities are key in the present time of a continuing financial crisis and the upcoming reform of the Economic and Monetary Union. Let me quote from your website. You are leading the team Euro and Social Dialogue, and you are responsible for such important things like presenting proposals to deepen the Economic and Monetary Union, making decisions about support for struggling Eurozone countries more democratically legitimate and better taking into account the social impact they might have. Third, developing proposals to encourage further structural reforms in Eurozone countries. Fourth, reviewing the fiscal and macroeconomic surveillance legislation, six-pack, and the new budgetary rules, two-pack. This is Eurospeech. For those who do not know what six-pack and two-packs means, just wait explanations from our distinguished guest, if he likes to give these explanations, otherwise in the discussion later on. Enhancing, fifth, the convergence of economic, fiscal, and labor market policies between EU countries, the European semester, again, Eurospeak. Sixth, promoting social dialogue and engaging with social partners at EU level. I think this is extremely important part associated with the economic stuff. And then steering the work of the Structural Reform Support Service. This is an amazing portfolio, and I feel that you must bear a great deal of the burden for what the 5 presidents report proposed in June this year, called Completing the European Economic and Monetary Union. Although our students are not returned yet, I'm happy to see so many, at least some, of the young and many elder guests as the audience here, and a warm welcome to all of you. I'm sure it is this responsibility of our dear guest and the title of today's speech today that has brought you here today, coming to discuss with our distinguished speaker the Euro and the future of Europe. In the wake of the Greek elections yesterday, we have a particular interest in understanding how you see the huge debt burden borne by the Greek people to be managed without intolerable social costs and without intolerable restrictions on democratic self-determination in Greece. In your mission letter, an interesting new device of Mr. President Juncker to guide the common efforts of his Commission to achieve its ambitious objectives. Juncker has sent to each of the commissioners and vice presidents a mission letter telling what they have to do in the next period of work. He recalls that the new Commission has an, I quote, exceptional opportunity, but also an obligation to make a fresh start, to address the difficult geopolitical situation, to strengthen economic recovery, and to build a Europe that delivers jobs and growth for its citizens. I think this is a remarkable task now. The words geopolitical situation certainly refers to Ukraine and to Syria, to name but 2 construction sites. It may also refer to TTIP and other issues of global concern. Yet, the task list for European politics has been extended since. The refugees from Afghanistan and Syria in particular, in addition to those from African countries, call for solidarity, as mentioned by Mr. Kühnel already, solidarity to a formerly unknown extent, solidarity with human beings in existential emergency, but also solidarity among the people in and the member states of the European Union. Recent history has taught Germans that openness for refugees running for their life is without legitimate alternative. Germany has a strong economy. It is in need for well-trained and intelligent workforce and has made an enormous benefit from the financial crisis in Europe. This entails a particular moral obligation and economic capacity in Germany. But Germany is part of the EU, and what is decided here will have an impact on other parts of the European Union: economic, social, and political impact. This should be borne in mind both sides, by our government and by our partners, when striving for the achievement of the general objectives of the new Commission's policy. The Commission will have to play its role also in these refugee policies. Challenges should be understood as an opportunity to give solidarity to people coming to find rescue here and a new chance in accordance with the values of the EU. Reconsider our foreign and development policies with a view to ensure secure living conditions in the regions of origin, and include the new situation, refugees in Greece, Italy, Croatia, etc., into the framing of European economic and financial policies. Neither the euro nor the future of the European Union, in my view, can be discussed without taking the refugee issue into account. Both regarding the refugees and economic and fiscal policies, decisions taken in one member state in part dramatically affect other member states. Coordination insofar would be the classical solution. As we have learned, however, a common framework for common policies is the better solution. It is even more democratic as it involves those who are affected by the decisions taken. This is the supranational method we have developed in the EU. It has worked efficiently in many essential policy areas. Why do we not come to this method in the new critical policies at issue, including economic and fiscal? Creating an adequate constitutional setting for the EMU in particular would imply to have common democratically structured decision-making in the field of economic and fiscal policies, as far as necessary to sustain the euro and a common monetary policy. The question should not be if we overcome the asymmetry of the EMU, but the extent and the conditions for doing so. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what we are here to discuss with our distinguished guest tonight. And Valdis Dombrovskis is more than qualified to take the floor here. Much like our Chancellor Angela Merkel, he has studied and graduated in physics. This is why you understand each other so well, I guess. But already knowing that in 1993, that one day he would need a specific qualification in economics for the present job, he added this to the education and graduated in 1995 also in economics. One step more than Angela. Between 1995 and 1998, he worked as a research assistant in Mainz in Germany, so he understands German, as a research assistant at the Institute of, listen, Solid State Physics. Of course, that's a technical expression for physics, but could be understand also solid state, the physics of solid, solidarity, etc. Prior to joining politics, Valdis Dombrovskis worked as a senior economist and chief economist at the Bank of Latvia, so has understood what money and finances are, from where he was called to serve as a Latvian Minister of Finance. To acquire a specifically European experience, he then became a member of the European Parliament. before he was named Prime Minister of Latvia in 2009. This is from where he was called in November 2014 to serve the European Commission as a Vice President. Dear Prime Minister, it is an extremely great honor for us and a great pleasure for myself to welcoming you here at the Humboldt-University in Berlin. Many thanks for coming to share your visions on the future of Europe with us. I should also like to thank our partners, the European Commission, the Stiftung Mercator and die Deutsche Post for the kind cooperation making this event possible. So, dear Mr. Dombrovskis, we are looking forward to your speech, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Distinguished guests, fellow Europeans. It's a privilege to be here at Humboldt-University, where many eminent speakers have stood and set out their vision of the future of Europe. And it's wonderful to be back here in Berlin. When I was here last time in April, I delivered a speech in Axel Springer building. I remember looking out at the view where the wall once stood, what separated the city. As we all remember, it was a quarter of a century ago when the wall came down and Germany was finally reunited. Reunited after 45 years of separation. I was a student in Latvia at that time, and I will remember forever the scenes of euphoric Berliners reunited on top of that wall. And Germany was not the only country clamoring for change. From the Baltic to the Adriatic, from Berlin to Bucharest, Europeans were hungry for freedom, peace, security, and prosperity. In my own country, the Republic of Latvia, independence was finally fully restored in 1991. Freed from the Soviet oppression, like so many fellow Europeans, we turned our attention to building a better future. We turned our attention to the European Union, an inclusive community of nations with the values we fought at its core. Greater economic and social prosperity for individuals and society as a whole. Security from foreign aggression. Human rights promoted as a fundamental basis of people's well-being, and fundamentally, peace. Jean Monnet, Walter Hallstein, and their contemporaries conceived the idea of European economic communities not only to rebuild Europe's economy, but also to ensure peace among nations that were at war just a few years before. Latvians saw membership of the European Union the means to fulfill those basic human aspirations. Years later, we saw joining the euro as a consolidation and confirmation of our anchor in Europe. So, after 25 years of breathtaking change, how well has the EU delivered against this promise of peace through economic integration and prosperity? Let me start with achievements that we so often are taking for granted. Let me start with peace. Hard lessons have been drawn from the World Wars, from Cold War, and from more recent conflicts in the Balkans. Through ever closer cooperation, we have ensured that the closest contact with the war for most of Europeans is through the history book. In 2012, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the European Union. It gave formal recognition to the peace, human rights, and democracy that has been carefully preserved across our continent. Yet it's constantly being tested. Not a day goes by without us seeing tragic images of those fleeing for war-torn countries, often risking their lives in search of stability and security in Europe. Conflicts are raging in our eastern and southern neighborhood. Russia's illegal annexion of Crimea and violation of Ukrainian sovereignty demonstrates that freedom, peace, and security within our borders is not an abstract consideration. Certainly not for the people in Baltic states, which are particularly vulnerable and still live with vivid memories of Soviet occupation. In the case of Ukraine, the testimony of European solidarity and strong cooperation came in an unanimous decision of EU members to impose sanctions against the aggressor. We stood by our values of democracy and the right to sovereign integrity of our close partner. Freedom, peace, and security must be preserved through a clear and united stance towards those who violate them. But their essence will be only preserved through continued European cooperation, integration, and solidarity. That leads me to the EU's economic achievements. At the heart of the EU's success is a promise to promote economic prosperity, to make Europeans better off through greater integration. The single market has achieved just that. Between 1992 and 2008, the free movement of people, goods, and services helped create almost 3 million new jobs. These benefits could be doubled if the remaining trade barriers were removed and if the digital single market was boosted. The EU is also about economic convergence. 352 billion euros, almost a third of the EU budget, are set aside from the cohesion policy up to 2020. EU regional policy funding has offered countless opportunities to the economically less developed parts of the EU. It has invested in people, businesses, infrastructure, and the environment. This means retraining people to equip them with skills necessary to find new jobs. It means building new roads or water treatment plants. It means helping companies to become more competitive. This is a tangible expression of European solidarity and inclusiveness. European solidarity and inclusiveness is particularly important within the euro area. Today, 19 member states and over 330 million people share euro as a common currency. The euro makes a powerful single market and even more attractive proposition for investors. It has reduced transaction costs for individuals and for businesses. It accounts for a quarter of global exports and more than 15% of global investment. A quarter of global foreign exchange reserves are held in euro. Some countries outside the euro area use euro as their official currency, either with a formal agreement with the EU, such as Andorra or the Vatican City, or more informally, such as Kosovo and Montenegro. And numerous countries peg the currency to it. Not just EU member states, such as Denmark or Bulgaria, but also countries further afield, such as Cape Verde, or countries of West African and Central African currency unions. For these countries, the euro acts as a strong anchor or reference currency. Contrary to some misperceptions, the crisis has not fundamentally affected the euro as a currency. Most Europeans still support the euro. According to the most recent Eurobarometer survey, support for the euro has almost reached the pre-crisis levels, with 69% of those surveyed in favor of the euro, compared to the 70% in 2007. And the markets have maintained their confidence in our currency. Even at the height of the Eurozone crisis, the euro's external exchange rate was closer to its historical maximums than to minimums. More recently, markets reacted calmly to events in Greece. There were very little spillover effects to other countries, and the stability of the euro area was not questioned. So, contrary to the skeptics, the crisis has not dented support for the euro. The euro remains a groundbreaking political and economical project. Over time, the sum of European achievements has been a remarkable journey towards economic development and convergence. When 75 million Central and Eastern Europeans joined the EU in 2004, their average income was half of the income of the old EU member states or EU 15. A decade later, it increased to 64%, almost 2/3. Since EU's enlargement to the east, the pace of change in countries like Latvia has been phenomenal. Latvia's nominal GDP has increased almost threefold. In real terms, purchasing power has risen by over 50%. And this is despite the country having experienced the deepest economic crisis in the EU between 2008 and 2010. Economic convergence has made the EU both attractive and unique. But to continue powering convergence, serious change is needed. I will offer just 3 reasons. First, there are immense long-term challenges for the European economy to remain competitive and sustainable in a global economy. Europe's workforce is shrinking. It has to create enough wealth to finance a non-working population, which will be growing in coming years and decades. By 2030, only 1 out of 2 citizens will be of the working age. So we are faced with 2 real options. Either we address our demographic challenges with the resources and capacity that requires, and we recognize the valuable input skilled immigration can make to reverse the trend, or our role in global economy will continue to decline, and it will be increasingly difficult to maintain the European level of prosperity. To give an example, in the past decade, Europe's share of the global output fell by 5 percentage points. Meanwhile, China's share of the world GDP almost doubled. Global competition is fierce and is becoming more fierce. Chancellor Merkel often says that Europe has 7% of the world's population, 25% of its GDP, and 50% of its social spending. Europeans work fewer hours and have higher salaries than most of their global competitors. Europe's welfare system is an inherent element of the European model. At the same time, it's among the most costly in the world. In coming years and decades, we'll have to address Europe's demographic challenges and ever fiercer global competition. Second, there was an uncomfortable lesson from the crisis. Many member states have not used the stability they gained by joining the euro to adequately address their economic challenges. Once the hurdles of joining the euro were overcome, reform efforts quickly faded. Nominally, Europe's prosperity and convergence had been improving before the crisis. Yet beneath this good news lay deep economic imbalances. Imbalances ranging from current account deficits to excessive public and private debt. At the same time, the financial sector was ill-supervised. It quickly built up large stocks of complex financial instruments, derivatives, and so on, which later turned out not to be as safe investments as once thought. Lending practices were often irresponsible without due evaluation of the risks. Available financing was too often directed to consumption, housing, and asset bubbles rather than to productive investment. These trends concealed that in reality, many member states were producing less and less competitive goods or services and ran bigger and bigger trade deficits. This lack of productivity and competitiveness, concealed by unsustainable borrowing, was laid bare by the financial crisis. A deep recession rapidly followed. And third, while the economic and monetary union should be a means to address our long-term challenges, it did not prevent the build-up of economic imbalances. Economic and monetary union is as yet incomplete. The EMU is incomplete by the standards of economic theory of optimum currency areas. And the EMU is incomplete by standards of those who proposed it in the first place. In 1989, when Jacques Delors set out his vision of an economic and monetary union, he was very clear, and I quote, Monetary union without a sufficient degree of convergence of economic policies is unlikely to be durable and could in fact be damaging to the economic community. The Delors report recommended clear fiscal rules for member states. It also recognized, and I quote, "In order to reduce adjustment burdens temporarily, it might be necessary in certain circumstances to provide financing flows through official channels, but on terms and conditions that would prompt the recipient to intensify its adjustment efforts." So how does economic and monetary union fare against this? When the euro was introduced, in order to join the new common currency, member states had to fulfill a set of key convergence criteria. But the economic and fiscal policy coordination that followed remained weak. No financial backstops within the euro area were envisaged. Only in response to the Eurozone crisis were a number of these weaknesses addressed. In the response to the crisis, we have introduced an upgraded macroeconomic governance framework to better coordinate economic policy among member states, the European semester. A macroeconomic imbalances procedure to detect and address economic imbalances early on. More sophisticated fiscal rules, the six-pack and two-pack regulations, and the fiscal compact. A financial backstop, the European Stability Mechanism, to provide temporary fiscal support to member states in difficulty against necessary policy conditionality. We have created a banking union to weaken the bank sovereign loop and to ensure financial stability. Now a word on a European Central Bank's monetary policy tools. After all, it was a famous Mario Draghi's "whatever it takes" that helped to calm down financial turmoil in Europe. Whatever it takes was referring to outright monetary transactions, ECB's commitment to buy member states' bonds in the secondary market in unlimited quantity if necessary. Recently, the European Court of Justice confirmed that outright monetary transactions are within the mandate of the ECB. The ECB is also helping the economic recovery with accommodative monetary policy, not least with quantitative easing. But there is still a long way to go to achieve economic convergence. Ladies and gentlemen, against those threefold issues, immense long-term challenges, underlying economic weaknesses, and yet incomplete EMU, it is no surprise that Europe's economic recovery has been slow and uneven. Effects of growth are still to translate into enough jobs and enough money in people's pockets. Unemployment is expected to fall this year to 9.6% in the EU and to 11% in euro area. Around 1 in 10 is still out of job. This is clearly not acceptable. Only last year, growth in the euro area started to pick up. This year, the real GDP growth is expected to be at 1.8% in the EU and at 1.5% in the euro area. As we see, economic recovery remains slow, even when it is being boosted by temporary tailwinds, low oil prices, a favorable euro exchange rate, and an accommodative ECB monetary policy. Even more of a concern is that many people are losing trust in the European project. So we must stop these trends, resolve tensions, restore trust, and come out stronger and united. To do so, we need to get back to the basics. We need to return to an economic and societal vision that had withstood the test of the time. We must base our work on the simple objective of economic convergence towards higher living standards. As the Delors report highlighted, economic convergence is absolutely necessary to make Europe's economic and monetary union sustainable over the long term. We now need a new push for economic convergence to provide real value added to Europe's citizens, to preserve and raise their living standards. We have to convince people from Riga to Berlin, from Athens to Paris, that they are better off with the EU, its internal market, and a strong common currency than without it. Economic convergence is not about uniformity. Economic policy must be adjusted to the specifics of each state, its economic structures, and its economical cycle. Economic convergence is about creating in every member state economic structures that are resilient and can adjust to change. They should allow businesses to grow and people to seize opportunities, sometimes against the resistance of special interest groups. They should support people in times of economic difficulties and help them to get back on their feet again. You can also think of it as convergence towards a highly competitive social market economy. An economy that, and Alfred Müller-Armack had put it, on the basis of competition unites free entrepreneurial initiative with social progress. An economy that protects diversity while creating unity and stability. An economy that is globally competitive. And that, in the words of the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, works for the people and not the other way around. These challenges are not confined to one member state alone. They are faced by all member states, big or small, north or south, east or west. So let Europe and its economic and monetary union be a catalyst to address them together. Let's support countries to capitalize on their comparative advantages and converge towards the top, not race to the bottom. Rebuilding trust and converging towards a highly competitive social market economy is one of Europe's major challenges today. The hard part is how to get there. Economic convergence is at the heart of the recently published report by the presidents of the 5 EU institutions. The report sets out a common vision towards completing Europe's economic and monetary union. As the Commission's Vice President for the Euro and Social Dialogue, I am responsible for coordinating this process. Ladies and gentlemen, many of the speeches delivered at this university over the years have set out visions to change Europe. What Europe indeed needs is a big vision, but also many small steps to get there. This is also the approach of the 5 Presidents' report. Let us start deepen the EMU by doing, reform the structure of our economy, and strengthen economic governance within the existing treaty. But let us keep a clear sense of purpose, economic convergence. To strengthen economic recovery and to facilitate convergence, we concentrate our effort in 3 areas: boosting investment, implementing necessary structural reforms, and maintaining fiscal responsibility. Investment in Europe has fallen by 15% since the crisis, and it has not recovered as fast as, for example, in the United States. The level of investment in Europe is still substantially below its long-term sustainable level of around 20 to 21% of GDP. To fill this shortfall, we have launched the Investment Plan for Europe, also known as a Juncker Investment Plan. It will mobilize 315 billion euros of public and private investment over the next 3 years. A European Fund for Strategic Investment will support projects in areas such as infrastructure, research, and innovation. A substantial part of the plan is directed towards supporting lending for small and medium enterprises. We are also working to diversify sources of financing to the real economy. In addition to bank lending, we should facilitate financing from the capital markets. The banking union will be complemented by a capital markets union, a single market of capital for 28 countries. Boosting investment alone, however, is not enough. It will only result in jobs and growth if we combine it with structural reforms to strengthen economic competitiveness. There are structural reforms to be implemented both at EU and member states levels. At the EU level, it's largely about deepening the single market, especially in areas like services, energy, and digital market. The single market is Europe's strongest lever to create new opportunities for economic growth and job creation. It is also an essential ingredient for economic convergence within the EMU. To name just one example, completing the digital single market could contribute 250 billion to our economy over the next 5 years and create hundreds of thousands of new jobs. Structural reforms at EU level also means better regulation. Doing at the EU level syncs with a clear European value added. Economic integration can create many opportunities, but it is structural reforms that enable member states to grasp these opportunities and to make their economies more resilient. Thus, the main responsibility for structural reforms lies with member states. Product and services markets need to be more efficient. It is simply unacceptable that people are shut out of jobs because of some professions remain closed. At the same time, we are calling for the tax burden to be shifted from labor to areas that are less detrimental to growth, areas such as consumption, property, or capital. Labor market and social policy must be reformed so they allow workers to seize opportunities and help them to get back on their feet again. In many countries, we need to address the problem of segmented labor market, with strongly protected jobs for some and very weak protection for others, mainly newcomers to the labor market. The result is a very high youth unemployment in these countries. And youth unemployment is one of the most pressing social problems today. In the EU, we have already created programs such as the Youth Employment Initiative to provide employment or training to young people. When dealing with labor market reforms, flexicurity should be the common leitmotif. This means a more flexible labor market enables workers to quickly grasp new job opportunities, encourages companies to recruit when they can, and allows them to adjust their workforce when necessary. Better social protection systems that match labor market flexibility with measures that support those suffering from the effects of harsh economic developments. Equipping workers with the right skills to quickly find another job in a rapidly evolving working environment. Provide targeted financial support to those at the risk of poverty. As regards labor market reforms, social partners, employers and employees have an important role to play. They are well placed to ensure the right balance between economic opportunities and good employment conditions. Many reforms are ultimately the responsibility of member states, but the reforms are at the interest of the entire EU. So how can this be reconciled? How can economic convergence be achieved? The European Semester of Economic Policy Coordination is an important part of the answer. Every year, based on the European Commission's economic analysis and together with member states, national parliaments, governments and social partners, we identify reform priorities in each member state. And we systematically monitor their implementation. European Commission is doing everything it can to use the full potential of the European semester to make it more focused, improve transparency and involve stakeholders. For the first time this year, we have broadly consulted on our analysis before giving reform recommendations. The rationale is to strengthen national ownership of the reforms and thus improve their implementation. I have myself traveled to most member states, including Germany, to discuss our economic diagnosis with governments, parliaments and social partners. One of the key elements to ensure economic convergence is competitiveness. As 5 President reports put it, and I quote, "Euro area governance is well established for the coordination and surveillance of fiscal policies. It needs to be improved in the broader and increasingly central field of competitiveness." To strengthen competitiveness, the 5 Presidents' report suggests that the National Competitiveness Authority should be created in each member state to follow both wage and non-cost competitiveness developments. But we may need to go further beyond the European semester and a strengthening of national structures. We may need to make the economic convergence process towards more resilient economic structures more formal and binding over time. We need to develop common benchmarks and standards for functioning product, services and labor markets, competitiveness, business environment, public administration, and certain aspects of tax policy. This is a challenging task with numerous questions for economists and lawyers. If economic reform is the heart of economic convergence, then fiscal responsibility and financial stability are legs on which it stands. Fiscal responsibility and financial stability are preconditions for economic growth and convergence. There is no such thing as sustainable economic development without sustainable public finances. And we certainly should avoid a repeat of the recent sovereign debt crisis. There are significant differences between EU member states. While Estonia has the lowest public debt level in the EU, just over 10% of the GDP, Greece has now reached some 180% and Italy is around 130%. We need to take into account different situations in different member states. Member states with excessive deficits need to continue their adjustment, while those with available fiscal space can use it to stimulate investment and the consumption side of the economy. For good reasons, the EU has strengthened its fiscal rules in the wake of the crisis. With the introduction of the six-pack and two-pack EU regulations and with the fiscal compact, we have stepped up fiscal governance. We need to ensure responsible and growth-friendly fiscal policies. This applies all the more to the currency union. However, these rules have not resulted in a stronger consensus on fiscal policy across Europe. For some people in Europe, European Commission is an enforcer of ruthless austerity. For others, not least in this country, we are far too generous in the application of the rules. Let me reassure all sides that the European Commission is faithfully applying the rules. Today, the heavy lifting in terms of fiscal consolidation is behind us. The euro area overall fiscal stance is now broadly neutral. But efforts are needed to reduce the debt burden over the long term. Ladies and gentlemen, reforms are often difficult. It takes time till they make effect, but they do pay off. This is my experience in Latvia. There are three lessons I take home with me. One, we front-loaded the necessary adjustment and reforms. It helped to regain financial stability quickly, and with this to return to the economic growth quickly. We were back to the year-on-year growth already in the second half of 2010, and for several years, Latvia was the fastest growing EU economy. We also accelerated the use of EU funds as a way to stimulate the economy. Two, we worked very closely with social partners and other stakeholders throughout the process. And three, while doing the adjustment, we created an additional social safety network to address the social consequences of the crisis, to help those mostly affected by the crisis, first and foremost the unemployed. Reforms are paying off. This is also experienced from Ireland, Portugal, and Spain. All these countries had to undergo very deep and popular economic reforms. Today, like Latvia, they are among the fastest growing economies in the EU. And it is experienced even from Greece. For years, adjustments and reforms were delayed in Greece. But while delaying the reforms, Greece was not able to ensure financial stability. And without financial stability, it was getting into deeper and more protracted recession. However, last year, things started to change. Greece was broadly on track with the program. The Greek economy was finally growing. Investment started to pick up. Unemployment was declining. Around 100,000 new jobs were created in Greece last year. Greece was delivering on its fiscal targets and even tapped the financial markets. So we were discussing with the Greek authorities how, with the help of some kind of precautionary arrangement, Greece will return to the market financing. The political dynamics, however, led Greece into different scenario. As a result, Greece's economic performance worsened once again, fiscal and financial instability returned, capital controls were introduced. At the beginning of the year, we were forecasting 2.5% growth for Greece this year. Now the forecast is some 2 to 2.5% recession. But the underlying growth potential is still there. If the reforms agreed in the new ESM program are properly implemented, Greece can grow again quite quickly. The European Commission continues to support Greece in this process with both financial and technical support. And finally, on reforms, let me offer the example of Poland and Ukraine. Let's remember Poland and Ukraine at the beginning of 1990s. Two neighboring countries of roughly similar size and GDP levels. In 1990s, Poland was implementing major structural reforms, so-called shock therapy. Ukraine was delaying the reforms and allowed oligarchs to gradually take control of the economy. Today, we can compare the results. In 1990, the Polish economy was just 20% bigger than the Ukrainian economy. By 2012, the Polish economy was 3 times bigger. Polish per capita incomes are now five times bigger than in Ukraine. Poland is a prospering member of the EU. Its former Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, is the President of the EU Council. Europe's economy is suffering. Giving Ukraine the perspective of the EU accession is a remote idea and beyond what many EU member states could currently accept. And here we are comparing the situation before annexation of Crimea and conflict in eastern Ukraine, which are adding another dimension to Ukraine's wars. Now, let me move to the fourth element of convergence, financial stability. The Delors report was based on the assumption that in an internal market, the banking and financial system would integrate more or less automatically. But the crisis had shown us that this clearly was not the case. As long as the banking sector remains under national control, it will remain fragmented with serious risks for the EMU. There was little alternative to building a banking union with its single supervisor and single resolution mechanism to wind up failing banks. Banking union also sets clear bail-in rules in case of the bank failures instead of the bailout. This ensures that taxpayers are not first in line to pay for banking sector mistakes. Ideally, banking union also requires that depositors' confidence in banks does not depend on the financial situation of individual member states. In a monetary union, confidence in the banking system is not just a matter for member states. It is in the interest of banks and citizens in the euro area as a whole to avoid financial crisis. This is why the Five Presidents report puts the European Deposit Insurance Scheme back onto the political agenda of the EU. In the coming months, the European Commission will announce proposals for the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, starting with a reinsurance scheme for national deposit guarantee schemes. Ladies and gentlemen, sooner or later we will need to consider a treaty change. The European Commission goes into this process with an open mind. We are facilitator of this process. Many member states, academics, social partners have shared the ideas over the summer. At the end of the day, we will help to shape a consensus around the common projects that are shared by all member states and, most importantly, to which European people are willing to subscribe. For the personal perspective, let me mention 4 principles that underpin this process. First, any further steps must take into account the nature of the EU as a system based on unity in diversity, or a homeland of our homelands, as Václav Havel once put it. The Delors report was very clear on this. Even after attaining the EMU, the community would continue to consist of different nationals with different economic, social, political, and cultural characteristics. The preservation of this would require a balance to be struck between European and national interests. Any attempts to steer and control the European economy fully through the central institutions in Brussels will fail. European economic policy making must continue to be based on real rules and commitments and on a system of checks and balances. The EU institutions have a strong role to play, but so will national governments and parliaments. And so will market forces, which can give warning signals when policymakers go astray. Second, more risk sharing must go hand in hand with stronger rules and more sovereignty sharing. This fundamental principle has underpinned everything we have done since the crisis, like the creation of the European Stability Mechanism as a robust firewall, at the same time strengthening the EU fiscal and macroeconomic framework. Let me give an example. As President Juncker said in his State of the Union speech a couple of weeks ago, over the medium term, Europe may need to develop the ESM to better deal with the shocks that cannot be managed at the national level alone. But we can do so only if Europe is prepared to take further steps towards joint decision-making. A future euro area treasury could be the place for stronger collective decision-making as outlined in the Five Presidents report. But let us start with understanding what exactly we want to achieve before creating new institutions. Third, completing EMU must not open up new rifts between those member states that do not share the current currency. Deepening the EMU must be open and transparent with non-euro area countries. Initiatives concerning the EU internal market should be done in the framework of all 28 EU member states. And fourth, any further steps towards European integration needs clear democratic control and accountability. The closer we come to the core elements of public policy, the stronger this need becomes. With these four principles and powered by the potential of the European economy, still the largest in the world, we can restart the convergence process inspired by the principles of social market economy and build a genuinely resilient economic and monetary union. Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot resist the temptation to conclude this speech with a reference to the founder of this university, Wilhelm von Humboldt. One of his key essays was about an attempt to define the limits of the effectiveness of public action. Ideen zu einem Versuch, die Grenzen des Staats zu bestimmen. Very much in the liberal spirit of his times, he defined these limits a bit narrower than I would see them today in the social market economy. But in a way, our task for the coming years to complete the EMU is a similar one. To define where independent decision-making at national level may reach its limits without undermining the stability and prosperity of the euro area and the EU as a whole. But also to define the limits of centralizing decision-making at the EU level without undermining flexibility and adjustability of economic policy making to the still different national circumstances of our member states. And what is probably most difficult, to develop a consensus on those limits shared from north to south, from economic policy makers to Europe's citizens. A consensus that puts Europe's common currency and its economy on stronger foundations. Economic growth, job creation, and social security is our best way to rebuild trust of Europeans and our best answers to those who claim that the European project is failing. From a broader perspective, Europe will need a strong economy so that it can live up to its responsibilities, decisively address the migration challenge in Europe, and support peace and prosperity in its neighborhood, especially by supporting those in our neighborhood who are fighting for European ideals, so that all the people who fought to be part of Europe 25 years ago, here in Berlin or back home in Riga, can be proud of it. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much indeed for this very stimulating account of first the historical conditions and events, and then the proposals for reform following the principles developed in the 5 Presidents' report. I would like now to open discussion and questions and answers, and I invite you to give your name first, and then you get the microphone, and we will collect, if you allow, 3 questions each, and then you get the floor back for trying a reply if the questions are not too difficult. But I think there's no such thing that a too difficult question. Only the answer sometimes is difficult. And if there is nobody to start with, I could start with a question, and you try to think over what you could put on the table as a question. For me, there's always a difficulty when I consider that the structure of the EMU was based on the centralized monetary policy, while the economic policies remain expressly in the responsibility of the member states, which needed and wanted to remain responsible now, responsible each on themselves for economic and fiscal policies. So convergence, you said, is the basic objective and also the foundation for a functioning Europe. But convergence is a promise the countries made to themselves when creating the EMU by cooperation, by well-behaving under this discipline rules of the treaty, but without strong, legally enforceable framework. So is the idea of autonomy in economic and fiscal policies combined or compared to the idea of convergence, which means we work together, we have common approaches on the policies. Is it not a contradiction in itself? And as you said at the end in the 5 Presidents' report, common decision-making, so more transfer of sovereignty in these areas is a condition for convergence only. Do you see any other solution? You mentioned the European semester. And as a part of this question, do you share this view that there is a contradiction in the approach? Now, the European semester is an attempt to achieve this kind of convergence. And I was informed, at least read it in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, that the European semester is not taken seriously by the national parliaments. What is your comment, your experience on that? Is the European semester, which is a mechanism which tries to lead national budgetary policies to a converging path, is that functioning? Or is the Commission, and you in particular, who was responsible to guide this and lead this process, are you happy or are you a little bit disappointed of how the outcome is.
Okay, thank you for this question. Indeed, I was trying to address it also in my speech, because this is something what Eurozone, Euro area, actually Euro area countries learned in a hard way during the crisis. That indeed we had this contradiction between centralized monetary policy and without member states being able to address their currency exchange rates, for example, and decentralized economic and fiscal policy. And something I was mentioning that indeed after the creation of the EMU, fiscal rules were there, stability and growth pact was there, but it was not really enforced. And member states were systematically breaching stability and growth pact without any consequences, and this facilitated to the build-up of imbalances which ended up in a very deep crisis in many countries. So what we now have is, so to say, an attempt to address this problem with stronger fiscal rules, with six-pack, two-pack regulations, with fiscal compact, with European semester, and I must say it certainly functions better than a previous system because it puts still much more pressure on member states, and basically fiscal rules are being enforced, and it also has rules, so-called preventive arm of Stability and Growth Pact. It has rules also for member states whose budget deficit is below 3% of GDP. Because previously, approach was often that, look, our budget deficit is below 3% of GDP, so everything is fine. Whereas member states were having rapid economic growth and their structural balances were deteriorating quickly. So now there is much more emphasis on structural balances, so looking at the situation, taking into account members' position in the economic cycle, and also dealing with the member states which are not in excessive deficit, and which have to also continue their adjustment towards medium-term budgetary objectives. So this framework is certainly strengthened. Of course, there are ways to improve it, and that's why I was mentioning also in a speech, and it's written also in a 5 Presidents report, strengthening the governance framework, revamping of European semester, more powerful use of macroeconomic imbalances procedure. It's all there going in the same direction. Then on European semester, what are the responses of member states, how receptive they are? Well, certainly this is not an easy exercise, but one could say that gradually member states are starting to see their fiscal and economical policies as part of the common concern, and European semester is becoming part of the national budgetary debates. And that's why we will continue with this approach to have actually discussions with parliaments, with governments, with social partners in the member states, so that there is more ownership of the process, so that they also can express their views, maybe contradict Commission's opinions on certain issues, so that at the end of the day we can arrive at the balanced solution which fits the situation in the member state while still respecting the rules. So I would say it's a work in progress. Now we certainly have better fiscal and macroeconomic governance frameworks than we had before the crisis, but there is still a way to go to improve it.
Mm-hmm. I understand that means there is some optimism possible. Yeah. In some way, if the system with the European semester worked well, other reforms would not be necessary, because then we had convergence. But the trouble is that the country-specific recommendations made by the Commission, how effective are they? How precise? They are more and more precise, but how much are they taken really into account? And national parliaments feel guided by that and not dominated, because they wouldn't like to be dominated by that. So it's a difficult balance, isn't it?
Okay, just to add one point on this implementation of country-specific recommendations. This is indeed an issue we're ourselves struggling with and looking at the ways to improve it. There are different assessments how well member states are implementing country-specific recommendations. European Parliament came up with a figure somewhere in a range of some 10 to 12%. European Commission came up with a figure somewhere in the range of 40%. The difference comes from how you count it. If European Parliament counts only those recommendations which are fully implemented by member states, then it's around 10–12%. If you count also those where member states have made some progress implementation or substantial progress in implementation and add some relative weights to it, then you arrive at around 40%. But as the name says, those are country-specific recommendations. Those are not orders. So there are no enforcement mechanisms associated with the recommendations, unlike Stability and Growth Pact, where there are enforcement mechanisms associated. So we only can improve implementation of country-specific recommendations through more ownership, or probably in a longer term, as I was saying in speech, also making this certain policy benchmarks more binding over time.
Thank you. Yeah, there's one question.
Danke sehr. Thank you very much. I'm Silvia Kalmer from the Hungarian Embassy in Berlin, and I would like to ask what's your opinion on the core Europe idea, which is usually mentioned as further evolution of the Eurozone and the European economic cooperation. Thank you.
Well, this idea of core Europe is being much discussed. I was not using it in my speech because somehow core Europe probably implies also the periphery, but I was outlining that while deepening the EMU, we should avoid new rifts or new divergences with non-Euro area countries. And we should be open and transparent to non-Euro area countries, also allowing non-Euro area countries to join certain mechanisms which are primarily meant for a Euro area. Like, for example, banking union. It's primarily meant for the Euro area, but is also open to non-Euro area member states to join if they wish so. And I was emphasizing like initiatives which concern EU internal market, including the initiative of the Capital Market Union, should be dealt in the framework of EU 28. So certainly by deepening the EMU, we should also keep in mind the need to preserve the unity of EU 28.
Thank you very much. May I just link into this last point? What I have not really understood in the 5 presidents report, and which is still an open question, I believe, in the European Parliament, where you have been a member and have a lot of experience, is a proposal to split the parliament or to create a sort of specialized Euro parliament to sustain and to follow the specific political questions on the Eurozone. Is that, in your view, a good and promising idea, or would that be the beginning of a splitting and the end of the unity of the European Union?
Well, this is a tricky question to answer from several points of view, both substantially and institutionally, for me as representative of European Commission. First, substantially, this idea is being discussed, but it was not outlined in a five-president report, so it's not part of the Commission's agenda while following up a five-presidents report. At the same time, I know that also discussions in the European Parliament itself are ongoing. There are some discussions maybe of having some specialized committees in Euro area format, similarly like there is a ECOFIN Council of the EU finance ministers and Eurogroup for Eurozone finance ministers. But then it's for European Parliament to decide how it's organizing its work institutionally. For me, from the European Commission, it's difficult now to comment or to tell how European Parliament should organize its work. But as a guiding principle, I would, well, I personally would still insist on doing as much as possible in the framework of EU28.
Thank you very much indeed. My look on the watch tells me that we are moving towards the end of this event today. If there's no specific question, let me just not summarize, but use this opportunity to first thank very much you, Vice President of the European Commission, for the time you have spent with us to explain the European monetary, economic and monetary union and this future the way ahead. And we hope, of course, very much that this way ahead, following the President's report, which is in certain way certainly yours also, will be very successful. First thing, I would also like to thank Herrn Kühner for the very nice and friendly introduction and thanks given to me, because today is the last Humboldt speech on Europe, which I at least moderate and organize in the capacity of an active professor of this university, because of the day after tomorrow I will get my notice to leave this university and go into pension and have a splendid life outside this university. So formally, this is the last speech organized in this, and that was the reason you mentioned that, and I'm very grateful for the very nice and kind words you have given to me. Third, I take this opportunity to thank Mrs. Müller, who not only organized these speeches for many years in an absolutely competent and effective and friendly manner, but also will continue to do so, at least in the interim period, perhaps also in the period when my successor, whoever it might be, comes to this job and would perhaps organize himself and take over this job for organizing the speeches. So these thanks being expressed, and it was very important for me to do so, I would conclude in giving gifts only to you in this case, not to all of you, but in your presence, and you are the witness that I did so. The first is to remember a little bit of Germany, Eastern Germany, Meissen, which is a porcelain and medallion of Meissen, which you can carry wherever you like. It's not too big, as a little souvenir to this day, which is, in my view, a wonderful day, both for the good result in the elections in Greece and for your wonderful speech today. Second, a book which gives you an insight in the history of the Humboldt-Reden. The first one is of Helmut Schmidt, who indeed gave the first official Humboldt speech on Europe. It was Joschka Fischer, as you said, who gave also a Humboldt speech, but it was not a Humboldt speech yet. It was only called yet later on Humboldt speech. And he was the origin of the idea to organize Humboldt speeches on Europe, and only invite for that heads of state and government, former or acting ones. This means because you have been head of state and government in the past, we could invite you as a Humboldt speaker, and not only, I say, as a Forum Constitutionis Europae speaker. This is the other series which is for others, but not the heads. So had you been only vice president of the commission, you would have only been able to speak in the Forum Constitutionis. What an important difference, yeah? No, but these are the Humboldt speeches, and the speakers before you, Mr. Kühnel already named and mentioned some of them. And this is the future. We have with the Sylvie Goulart, you certainly know Sylvie Goulart, who organized a study together with us, with the Walter Hallstein Institute, the Krise demokratisch überwinden, or a democratic solution to the crisis, reform steps towards a democratically based economic and financial constitution for Europe. And perhaps for you it's nothing new in this, but perhaps it gives you and your collaborators a little inspiration how we think this development could take shape in the future. So I would like to give you this little book also from last year. Thank you very much to you first, to Mr. Kühnel second, and to all of you for coming here and having shared with us the visions for the future of Europe. Thank you very much.